Thank you everyone for joining. Welcome to our second event in celebration of Hispanic Heritage Month here at WSI. Our Hispanic Network meets on monthly on Wednesdays. You can find our meeting calendar and Zoom link on our SharePoint page, which I will share the link in our chat box momentarily. Everyone is welcome to attend our meetings. Allies are encouraged. Our page also houses resources, and if you've missed one of our past events, you can also find video recordings of those there. Our Hispanic and Latin network hopes that this event serves a few purposes for those joining today and those viewing the recording at a later date. First, we hope it provides context to everyone on the diversity of identity within the Hispanic and Latin communities to those who don't identify as such, and also to those who do, because our identities are complex. Second, as this event will also lead to discussion on Latin representation in media, we hope that this provides insight to those of us in decision-making roles within WSI on the nuances we should be conscious of when speaking to the Hispanic and Latin communities via marketing or through our product and collaborations. I do want to remind everyone that this is a safe space. While we aim to hold time for Q&A, if you have any questions or observations throughout the presentation, please comment in the chat box or the Q&A box, and our presenters will do their best to answer your questions throughout the presentation. So without further ado, I am happy to introduce and welcome Uma Joshi Garcia to our event. Let me spotlight her. There she is. She is an ethnic studies educator and advocate who led us on a robust and interactive conversation of identity last year. And we also welcome Alonso Garcia, who is a sports and social media marketer. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, thanks everybody. Thank you for being here and inviting me back again.
Thank you. We're super excited to have you. All right, I will kick it over to you guys for the presentation.
Okay, cool. Hi, everybody. Like I said, my name is Uma. We're going to do some introductions in a second, but I'm just going to kind of share my screen with you all. Our presentation today is on Latin American representation and identity in the media, knowing that the media is really broad. So we're going to touch on just a few things because we only have an hour today with you all. So it's not a fully comprehensive presentation because like I said, the media is huge, but we wanted to kind of touch on a few things and hopefully have a good conversation with you all. So hopefully y'all can all see my screen. Cool. Okay, so we'll just again do a brief introduction. My name is Uma. I was here last year as well. I'm an ethnic studies teacher and social studies teacher, but also mainly an advocate for students and teachers of color. I primarily taught in the Bay Area. I've since relocated from the Bay, but I'm still working in education and staying super connected with the education community and making sure that students of color and teachers of color feel supported. I'm of Caribbean and Indian descent. My father is from India and my mom is from the Dominican Republic. So I have a very unique perspective on identity. And I also grew up on the East Coast and the West Coast. So I have a different perspective on how a lot of Latin identity is kind of seen in the United States. And I'll pass it to you, Alfonso.
Hello, everyone. It's very happy to be here with all of you today. I'm Uma's husband, Alfonso. I've been working in sports and social media for the past 7 years. I am currently at a digital media company called La Vida Baseball, where we celebrate and spotlight Latinos in baseball. And both my parents are from Nicaragua, so I am Nicaraguan American.
All right, cool. And there's a cute photo of us. Yes, we are married. We're college sweethearts and we're Giants fans. So there's us at a Giants game for context. Okay, so just wanted to start off by doing some land acknowledgements, which I want to preface just as a teacher and someone in the education community. I actually have a very conflicting view on land acknowledgements because I feel like they don't really do much to actually take action on things. So I wanted to do my land acknowledgement a little bit differently, but just especially highlight that as people in general, but specifically people from the Latin American community and diaspora, that we pay homage and respect to our Indigenous ancestors and community that are still present here today. A lot of people from Latin America have Indigenous roots, so it's really important for us to pay homage to that. And so the ways that I want to do that is by highlighting a few things, and I'm going to put 2 links in the chat actually to highlight those. So first is a website that you may have heard of. It's called Native Land California, and it actually can show you a map of where your community is located and which Indigenous peoples were on that land and are still there today. So I would definitely encourage you checking that out. Another thing that's actually really specific to the Bay Area is a land trust that is run by Indigenous women in the Bay Area, and they actually have a land tax called Shumi that is a contribution that you're able to make to support their work and the work that they're doing in the Bay Area. So I'm going to put those in the chat for you all. It's a great place to volunteer if you are able to give your time, and it's also a great place to donate if you're able to like give some of your money as well. So I love doing acknowledgements, but I like to take action on things, and so I wanted to make sure I was able to give you all some tangible things that you can take action on in terms of supporting the Indigenous community.
Sorry, Uma, just one question. We did get a comment saying that the chat is showing us disabled. If you have any questions, please place it in the Q&A.
Oh, okay, cool. I will make sure that I can see that. Okay, awesome. Thank you. Okay, so are people not able to write in the chat then?
At the moment, no, but I'll
Okay. Okay, cool. Well, that's okay. I guess you can just kind of say it to yourself. I don't know how to best do this virtually, but we wanted to know who was in the space and how do you identify and where your family is from. So we'll hear about that from our panelists who are here today, just a little bit more about how you all identify and where your family is from. But okay, I can see someone in the, Mexican American Monterrey. Okay, cool. I can see people answering on here. So yeah, if you would like to kind of put in the chat how you identify and where your family is from, that would be super cool. And then we can kind of see it in the Q&A. Okay, so we just wanted to break down some identifying terms for everyone, just to kind of provide some historical context to how we can identify. And just to be clear, there's really no way that there's no right or wrong way to identify. Like everyone can identify the way that they want to. These are just some of the ways that we see the Latin American identity being used as identifying terms in the United States specifically. So the first word is Hispanic, which is probably the most popular word in the United States. And it's because it's actually the first word that actually appeared in the US Census in 1980 to describe people from Latin American countries. And so the term Hispanic is used to describe people who come from Spanish-speaking countries or are descendants of folks from Spanish-speaking countries. So the term is a lot more about language versus heritage. And there's a little bit of pushback on the word Hispanic based on the region you're in, just because it does include Spain, and folks kind of have some sort of conflicting ideas on whether Spain should be included in the conversation about Latin Americans specifically in the United States. So, but it's very, from someone who grew up on the East Coast, that's a word that's heavily used in that region. So again, these terms are used based on region as well. Latino and Latina is another word that can be used, is someone from Latin American descent or geographically from a Latin American country. And this term originated in the Napoleonic era to categorize folks from the Caribbean and South American countries. Right now, I would say it's probably the most popular term that's used in the United States to describe those of Latin descent, but again, that's based on region. And then we have another word, Latinx or Latine, which is a gender neutral term to kind of push back on the gender norms of the word Latino, Latina for folks who maybe don't identify as either of those two genders. Contrary to popular belief, this term actually was coined by Afro-Indigenous communities in Brazil. There's like a misconception that it was coined in some sort of elite Ivy League school and it's like a very elitist term, but that's actually not the case. It was actually coined by like Afro-Indigenous people who wanted just a more inclusive term. So that's another term to use. For reference, what I'm going to use in this presentation is Latin American. That's just the term that I use for myself personally, but like I said, there's no right or wrong way to identify yourself. And my preference for myself in my personal life is to always say like I'm either Caribbean or I'm Dominican, because I like having that sort of context. So okay, so our presentation today is going to be about the media, but specifically mainstream media, which refers to a diverse array of media technologies that can reach a large audience via mass communication. In this country, what we're going to see is that mass media is something that's accessible and something that is actually spoken in English, in the English language. So a lot of our mass media that we see is in English because that's the dominant language of our country and is accessible, meaning like if you don't have like if you have basic cable, you're able to kind of view like kind of like a mainstream media market. If you don't have, you know, different types of channels or networks, you're still able to view things. So the context of our presentation today is going to be talking about mainstream media, knowing and acknowledging that there's different types of media out there and that there's different leverage points, but we're specifically going to talk about mainstream media. And that can encompass a lot of things. That can encompass books, movies, film, television, radio, social media. All of those things can kind of fall under this bracket of mass media. So here's where we're going to kind of kick it off to our panel. We have a great panel here today, just to like hear from some people. We would love for the panel to just kind of introduce yourself, maybe what's your ethnic background or where your family is from. And then we have some kind of guiding questions for you all. The first one is, do you feel like your identity has been represented in the mainstream media, either in the past or present? If so, what are some like examples of things that you felt really connected with? And if not, what would you like to see more of? So again, just a quick intro of who you are, maybe like your role within the organization, if you want to do that. And then we're going to just kind of answer these questions. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing. And then y'all can kind of jump in.
I'll go first. I'm Chanel Palacios. I identify as Mexican. I'm Mexican American, but I've just never added the American when I say it, but I am Mexican American. I'm on the West Elm brand. I work in site merchandising. So that's me. And oh, I'm sorry, I already forgot the question. When we feel represented, right? To be honest, probably the first time and the only time for like a really long time was after watching Selena. So, you know, classic movie, but you know, the scene where they're like talking about how not really enough for Mexicans and not really enough for Americans. That was like the first time that I really felt seen. And I was probably like, I don't know how old I was, but that came a while ago. And then there was a big, you know, gap for a really long time of like not really seeing anything unless I was watching like a novela on, you know, Telemundo or something. And I think once I got to college and it started to be much more you are other, that's when I started just craving and seeking it out. And I really dove into, you know, literature from Latina authors really. And I think there's just like big gaps in my life in terms of seeing that representation in the media, but I tend to seek it out now in literature.
I can go next. So I am Tatiana Alfaro, and I currently am on the West Elm brand in production for the website. And honestly, I don't remember the first time I felt like truly represented. I feel like as a kid, you're also very like unaware of things like racism and like there's like minor aggressions. Oh, and I'm Peruvian. So actually probably the latest driver of feeling represented in the media has kind of been like, I know Bad Bunny just won like Artist of the Year, and honestly it kind of feels like, well, it is a huge deal because, you know, like the world is experiencing Latino music, they listen to music in Spanish, they really like it, and I think he's really great for a number of reasons. Like he gives back to the community. He's I don't know, like he plays with gender roles in like a really interesting way. And most importantly, he makes bangers. But I've also just been exploring my culture through reading. I'm currently listening to Gothic on Audible in Spanish, or Mexican Gothic. It's really good.
Hi, everybody. I'll chime in. My name is Junior Vaca, Ignacio Vaca on email. I lead the photo studio sample warehouse operations and facilities team now for WSI. And I grew up in Texas, and I used to always joke with people that I'm Texican because my family was kind of from Central Texas the whole time and were drawn into the United States. So my family was very much, my mom and dad were very much discriminated against when they were kids and dropped out of school to work in the fields, basically. So they made it a very strong point that my sisters and I would get educated and not speak Spanish and not have an accent and all that stuff, which is horrible in so many ways, but totally understandable given where they came from. To me, yeah, very much like Chanel said, I remember like watching Selena on TV and kind of like joking about that too, because it was very much the same. Like people that I grew up with and even some of my own cousins would say, dude, you're trying to be white because I didn't speak Spanish. And I'm like, I'm not trying to be white. I'm just trying to be successful, you know, and I kind of struggled with that a lot earlier. And then through the years, you know, you kind of figure stuff out. And but I think again, like when the George Lopez show started on TV, like my family and I were like, we got to watch this, you know, and then like some of it was really funny, some of it hit home, and some of it was kind of extreme. And then other like, you know, movies that you would see, it's like the only Mexican actors seemed like they were like, you know, like the bad guy from the barrio, you know, like number one, you know, and they had very few lines and things like that. And my daughter's a filmmaker, and it's one of the things that she really tries to focus on is making sure that there's representation kind of everywhere from all different backgrounds. And that's why I love doing stuff like this and getting other people's perspectives and experiences.
All right, I guess I'm last but not least. All right, so my name is Pavel Lizardo. I work out of the East Coast Distribution Center in New Jersey. I am from the Dominican Republic, if it's not noticeable for some. So, you know, kind of like Tatiana, I really can't remember when I started, specifically when I started to kind of see more and more of you know, of Hispanics in social media. But I will say that, you know, I'm very passionate about music. And, you know, I was a couple of years ago, I was in a concert, and, you know, it's always interesting. Yeah, let's go to the art. It's always interesting to kind of like go to concert and you know, understand the type of people that are going to these concerts. And you know, it was very enlightening to see that it's not just nowadays, it's not just Spanish people or Hispanic or Latinos going to concert. Like it's everyone. And you know, and I think that the whole reason behind it is because of social media, because you know, because there's a genre for everyone. There is, you know, if you like funny or comedy, like, you know, you can definitely look that up on TikTok or Instagram. If you know, if you're passionate about music, you know, there's artists out there like Bad Bunny that are, you know, that are just killing the game. So, you know, I thought that was interesting and enlightening to see that, you know, aside from like, you know, them doing good and you know, them being successful, that's good for them. But, you know, it's also good for us and as a community. And, you know, in addition to that, I think it's just a great opportunity, and it just goes to show that this is a land of opportunities. And you know, we come here to make a story for ourselves, and you know, more than make a story for ourselves, we are putting Hispanic people on the map, which is great to see.
Thank you all so much for sharing. Oscar, did you want to share too? I don't mean to put you on the spot, but.
Oh, yeah. Sure, I'll hop on. I'm Oscar Perez. I am a senior buyer in Global, and I identify as a Latino. My dad is from Puerto Rico. My mom is from Mexico. And because of that mix, I am very racially diverse. Right, the Caribbean has a lot of influences, and although I don't, my grandma is an Afro-Latina Puerto Rican, Afro-Puerto Rican, and even though I don't present as such, right, that's still part of my background and how I also perceive the world. And let's see, in terms of, I probably agree with Chanel. Selena, the movie Selena was probably, I mean, I remember like the day Selena died. And in my household, we mostly just consumed Spanish media. So I always saw myself identified in the media that we consumed at home because it was always Spanish TV. But I think the Selena movie was probably the first time it's like, oh, it's an English movie and it's about like someone who I listen to and identify, and just seeing that on the big screen, a movie in English, right, with some Spanish, but predominantly English. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you all for sharing those responses. I think it's always just really cool to hear that a lot of us have a very shared experience as people in the United States. They're different and unique in ways that are important, but there's also like almost like a shared experience that we struggle still to like find that one pinpoint or that one time that we really saw ourselves in the mainstream. And so I think that's kind of what we're going to be looking at today, as well as like, how are we seeing these artists and these people that we've been watching for a long time or we've been following for a long time actually make it big. Like you're going to a concert that's predominantly in Spanish and you have people from all different backgrounds there. And what does that mean? And how does that expose our culture? And yeah, please share in the chat where were your points as growing up or as an adult that you felt like you saw yourself represented in the media or mainstream media. I see some great examples in the chat, but please do continue to kind of feed the chat with some of your examples because we would love to see those. So yeah, we're going to kind of keep it pushing. Hopefully we'll have time for one more discussion with our amazing panelists, but we're going to kind of look at some other things as well. So I wish we had a little more time, but that's okay. I'm going to put this link in the chat. It's actually a really great timeline of what Latinos specifically, like the Latin American community, has looked like in Hollywood, which I think is a really critical place in which a lot of people consume what they know about cultures, right? So in the United States specifically, that is so media focused and media drawn, you'll learn very quickly that a lot of things that people know about other cultures is from TV shows or movies. It actually has nothing to do with being in that community itself. And so that's where we see like some of the kind of issues play out, and some of the great things play out is through Hollywood. It's pretty much one of the biggest places that you can actually expose other people and other cultures without ever meeting those people, which is really interesting. So it's a really long timeline and it's really in depth, but it's really great. So I put the link in the chat so that you all can kind of look at it on your own time if you'd like to. But there's a few important things I kind of want to point out, is that a lot of people that are not in the dominant white community in the United States are oftentimes stereotyped in mass media. And so if you really want to look historically at the birth of that, you have to look at the film Birth of a Nation, which if you haven't, it's actually like a really crazy movie to watch in 2022, but I would actually really encourage people to it's a historical film, but in the film, it actually talks a lot about just the issues in this country in terms of the racialized identity in this country, the ways in which folks have been stereotyped. And that is actually a pinpoint in like US pop culture specifically on how we start seeing actually the birth of stereotyping. And so we see a lot of stereotypes in the Latin community. There's the Latin lover. There's like the immigrant, the person who like crosses the border. There is where is it here? I'm going to come back to some of these. There's like The Maid is like a big one that we see like a lot of movies with Latino women playing maids, and then The Drug Lord is also another big one. So this like goes really in depth on just like where these stereotypes have come from, but also what I love about this timeline is it highlights things that are important to our culture as well. So the first time someone from the Latin American community won an Oscar, which was Rita Moreno, who was a Puerto Rican actress, and back in the 1960s these things were unheard of, right? But what we're seeing in 2022 is that, okay, well, where are more folks, right? This happened in 1960, it's 2022. How many more Latin American women have we seen nominated for an Oscar or winning an Oscar, right? So that's where like some of the things we should start questioning is, yeah, that was great. And where are, you know, more folks who we can see represented here? So it's a really great timeline. Obviously, like we have seen things change a lot over the years, which I'm actually gonna kind of move on to next. But it's really cool to kind of delve into this timeline and really see like where we have been in terms of Hollywood specifically, because that is the way that people communicate stereotypes or amazing things or cultural identities. Hollywood is the main place for a lot of people to get those things. So yeah, like I said, we've kind of come a long way, but we're not where we need to be yet, which is always a good thing. It's good to see progress, and it's good to want to see more change. So I saw One Day at a Time in the chat. We love that show too, and was really sad that it got canceled, but that was a great show to kind of just highlight, you know, the Cuban American experience. We have Latin American people actually coming into mainstream roles, such as Wednesday Addams. Like that show I know is coming out in a month or so on Netflix. Obviously Bad Bunny has like transcended all cultural like identities. For someone like me from the Caribbean community, I've been listening to like this type of music for a long time, but have never seen people from all different cultures and communities listen to it. So to see someone like that go mainstream is really cool. But yeah, I think we've done some really great things. But like I said, there's obviously a lot more that we can still do. So I want to hear from you all in the chat. What are just some issues that you've seen in the media in terms of Latin American representation? So I would love to just hear from some folks and just kind of hear like what are some issues that you've seen in the media. Obviously we've seen some great things, but what are some kind of issues that y'all have seen? And then I'm going to touch on a few and then we'll kind of move on after that. But let's see if anyone has some. Oh yeah, Gordita Chronicles is really good too. That's a great show. Okay, cool. I'm seeing lack of intersectionality, stereotyping. Yep. What are some other issues that y'all have seen? Yeah. Never leading roles, misrepresenting the nationality, assuming any Latino can play a role. Yep. Whitewashing harmful representations, limited time shows. Yeah, these are really good examples. So I'm going to touch on a few. Yep, racial microaggressions for sure. Yeah, keep putting those in the chat because these are really good. We kind of touched on stereotypes a little bit, so I won't talk too much about that. Whitewashing and colorism are huge. Just really big issues that are happening in the community. Colorism is something that, you know, kind of determines who is worthy of representation based on skin color. And that's a big issue that we're seeing in the Latin American community, is that a lot of people in the mainstream community, like if you can name like major actors and actresses, a lot of them look very, very similar. They kind of have that light caramelly skin tone. We don't see a lot of Afro Latinos kind of represented in the mainstream media or as lead roles. That's really important too. Whitewashing is also huge. Essentially, like, I'm going to give an example that is really frustrating to me. But what we're seeing is that because the Latin American community is really popular right now, people really want to represent that community. We're seeing Latin American stories, but we're not seeing them portrayed by Latin Americans or people from that group. I think someone talked about how you know, we kind of like blanket statement who can represent which types of characters, but I'll give you a present day example. James Franco was just asked to play Fidel Castro in a biopic film. So besides that, James Franco is like a problematic human being in general. The fact that he's been asked to play Fidel Castro in a biopic is just like crazy to me. But again, these are the things that are happening in 2022 because right now it's popular to share Latin American stories, but it's not popular to actually talk about their experience and actually have them in the writer's room, the director's room, those types of things. So that's just an example. Obviously, there's cultural appropriation that happens. I think that goes hand in hand with whitewashing, just allowing anyone to kind of share our stories, but share them in a way that's from the dominant narrative versus the narrative of our own people. Because like I said, folks are getting popular. People feel like that's the way to kind of show support to the community, which is something we're going to talk about in a little bit. And then some other things is just like appeasing to the dominant demographic. So saying like, it's okay, at least we're getting a movie about Fidel Castro. I can't tell you the amount of times I've heard that, like from the Latin American community, where people are just overlook like issues like colorism and whitewashing for the sake of representation. And so that's where I ask, like, well, what does representation really mean to you? Does it mean just having your story, or does it mean having your story written by someone from that community, directed by someone from that community, with actors from people in that community who experience these things? And so that's always my question, is like, what does representation truly mean to you if you just want to see a story for the sake of a story? And then another thing too is just like the pitting of ethnic groups against each other, which I've seen a lot too, is like almost like a what about me-ism. Like we're seeing, the rise in Asian American stories, and then we hear, well, what about us? And I think, I think there's room for all different ethnic groups to be represented, but do we have to compete with each other? No, like that's falling under the same trap that we've kind of been told our whole life, is that we all have to compete for attention in a dominant narrative when our stories are all important. So those are just some of the issues. And I've seen a lot in the chat too. What I hear a lot is James Franco is part Spanish, but then there's that conversation about Spanish people from Spain. Like, are they Latin American? I would say no. I would say they're Spanish, but that's a whole other conversation, right? Of like who gets to kind of, represent certain folks in the story. So before we kind of segue over to Alfonso's section, he's going to talk mainly about like just like what we've seen on social media, which is a really, really great way for us to see an example of how we've really gone mainstream, is just to kind of show you all that Latin Americans spend a lot of time engaging in media content. So even though they only account for 17% of the population right now, they spend like over 90 plus minutes watching online videos per month. 47% of content creators online are Latin American. They buy a lot of movie tickets, they go to movies. So they're engaging in media and content in this country. And so I think it's really important to know that, so that we can then see like where that representation is headed. All right, passing it to you.
Thank you, Uma. And so to segue into talking about Latin American representation and social media, I think anytime we talk about social media, it's really important and to acknowledge inevitably that age is part of the conversation. Younger age groups have a lot of power in terms of what's popular, what's trendy. They're a strong voice when it comes to defining what's in style, what music is trending, and what social media apps are most popular. Of course, age is not the only factor in defining some of these things, but it's definitely significant. And when we talk about age and Latin American representation, this all gets tied together with the rise in popularity of Latin Americans and their culture in the United States. In 2018, Nielsen actually conducted a report called The Online Lives of Latinx Consumers. And at the time, they made the declaration, which we're starting to see manifest today. One of their biggest claims was that Latin Americans are the youngest ethnic group in the United States. And with that comes a lot of power in the future. So the younger age demographic, the bigger the age demographic, that means that there's going to be a lot more emphasis placed in terms of what they're watching, how they're deciding to spend their money, what products they are buying day-to-day life. So all of these things are going to be really, really important, and we're starting to see that in 2022. Next slide, please. So Latin Americans are very active on social media, and this was also a part of that report. We're more likely to share content, we're more likely to use it to stay connected with family and friends, and we spend the most time on social media compared to other ethnic groups. So if we're so active and we're sharing so much content and we're using these apps at a far greater rate than other groups, then we should be seeing ourselves represented way more, right? Yes and no. Next slide, please, Emma. As Uma mentioned earlier, when it comes to the mainstream, Latin Americans have been largely left out of the conversation. So our response as Latin Americans throughout our time here in the United States has been to create our own spaces. And within those spaces, we've been able to tell our own stories, build our own communities, shape our own narratives, and we've been able to create a space that's our own. You know, in my opinion, when it comes to Latin Americans, we've carved our own representation through 3 different stages of media, or at least those are the 3 different stages that I've seen while I've been alive. The first is the traditional media, when television was king. You know, I saw some examples there of some people saying that they saw themselves represented through Univision and Telemundo, and that's really true. I mean, I remember growing up, you know, in my house, my grandma lived with us, and when I got home from school, she was flipping between these channels, watching Caso Cerrado, Primer Impacto, watching the novelas at night. So having these channels being played all the time growing up was really significant in shaping that. Then as social media became more legitimized, it gave rise to the niche brands that I've included here. Those of us who grew up in Latin American households, you know, we found and continue to find ourselves drawn to the memes, stories, user-generated content that these accounts are sharing through Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. Next slide. And then now, many Latin Americans, we've taken the matter of representation into our own hands, and we're creating the content ourselves on channels like TikTok, YouTube, and Instagram Reels. And as we mentioned before, since Latin Americans are such a big group participating on social media and we're so active, that means there's a bigger chance of engagement with people who feel represented with this content. You know, the content created for and by Latin Americans in the United States, it ranges. It's not just like the blanket monolith that, you know, people outside of the community think, well, Latino, then it's like, you know, content that we see on Univision has to be in Spanish. What these content creators have created are very niche stories. You know, it could be something from history, giving you the historical context of the rise of someone like Bad Bunny. It could be different dance styles, dance moves. It could be about growing up in a Latin American household and the different ways that our parents pronounce different things. It could be about the street vending culture and giving more attention and praise to those people that are hustling. Or the latest example, this guy who's blowing kisses as he's working in, you know, in a carniceria, I presume, that's really taken over TikTok. So it really ranges. And the bottom line, it's really about knowing the audience, right? Each of these creators are telling stories or creating content for specific audience in mind. It could either be the Mexican community, Mexican American community in California or the Southwest, or it could be the Dominican, Puerto Rican community in the Northeast. But at the end of the day, it all falls under the category of Latino, but it's just the different kind of broad niches that exist for content. Next slide, please. Yeah, that one. But now with the rise and popularity of Latino representation in digital content, it's also leading to other folks who are starting to notice and want a piece of the action because of the sizable audience that Latin Americans represent and how the proximity to the community can lead to likes, it can lead to attention, it can lead to more followers, and eventually that represents revenue opportunities, right? Like all of these content creators are creating revenue one way or another, partnering with brands, partnering with different sponsors. So, you know, with Latin Americans becoming so popular, there's an opportunity to create revenue from that. And as a Puerto Rican poet, Benito Martinez Ocasio said, ahora todos quieren ser Latinos, in his new song, El Apagón, and which roughly translates to now everyone wants to be Latino. So we're starting to see more and more cringy examples of people cosplaying Latin American representation with the goal of gaining entry into the community by doing the bare minimum. And here's just some examples that have been cited within the community or people outside of the community that have kind of called them out. Kylie Jenner putting out a new lip gloss line called Besitos, someone who hasn't ever acknowledged the Latin American community the entire time that they've been building their empire. And now all of a sudden they're launching brands that kind of, you know, with the aesthetic of Latin American representation. And these are just some examples of just how problematic, some just different problematic examples of people cosplaying, turning popular items like esquite in Mexican culture and calling it Mexican street corn salad. Yeah, so those are just some examples. So then now with this great power and with this great power that we have as Latin Americans and those who identify as Latin American, now it comes with a great responsibility, and we have to be very careful in terms of who we invite to the carne asada. And this term, inviting people to the carne asada, basically the carne asada is like the cookout on the weekends when your family gets together, celebrating a birthday, just having some sort of gathering. Once in a while, you'll invite a neighbor, a friend, someone who's not part of the community. And so now inviting someone to the carne asada has become that kind of medal that you give to someone who's not part of the community on social media. So if you see them creating content with Latin American representation, a lot of people will be like, oh man, you're invited to the carne asada. But we have to be careful, because it's important when considering Latin American representation on social media that it's done with great detail and authenticity in mind. I'll always remember the example that it took Pixar 7 years to fully develop Coco, because they really wanted to make sure that they got all of the details right. They wanted to make sure that this love letter to the A Los Muertos, where many Latin Americans and non-Latin Americans were involved, had the best intention and respect to the culture in mind. So 7 years, yes, it's an extreme example, but the bottom line is to always remember that at the end of the day, Latin Americans are a community, and with community comes celebration, triumph, and struggle. It's great to celebrate the community, but we also have to acknowledge that sometimes there's going to be tough moments. And a lot of people right now are speaking up about people who've used Puerto Rican aesthetic, Puerto Rican culture in their marketing campaigns or in their content, and now haven't spoken up now that there's issues with Hurricane Fiona on the island. So these are things that we need to keep in mind. Who's actually there to participate in the community, or who's only there to participate to gain opportunity and gain revenue from the community. And so the next community discussion that, these were just some form of, representation advertising that, as we were discussing the subject, myself and Uma, we found, there's different companies that have gotten involved with Latin American representations. You're definitely not going to appease everyone, but these are definitely some examples of some brands that have done a pretty well job in terms of getting the details right, making sure that the community feels well represented. Target has been doing it well before this report came out from Nielsen. I can remember even going back to 2015, they were already starting to do more and more inclusion of Latin American representation. They did deals with, Jane the Virgin at the time, where you would always hear Target come up in that show. Here's an example of the De Lo Mio sneakers with Dominican representation that came out in 2018, where they really partnered with the Dominican community to create this sneaker that represented Dominican culture, and they had hired Dominican photographers to really tell the story of the sneaker. And then the Disney, who of course, like I said with Coco, they really take their time and do things with great detail. Right now doing a lot of Coco activations at Disneyland because it's around Dia de los Muertos and Hispanic Heritage Month. And so for our community discussion, one thing I'd like our panel that we had earlier share is I'd like to hear your thoughts, and everyone feel free to leave your thoughts in the chat about these questions. Do you see companies and celebrities using Latin culture as an opportunity or as a way to connect with the community? And is there a way to meet in the middle with both?
Yeah, thank you, Alfonso. And I'll put this in the chat so that y'all can kind of see the questions, but we'd love to have our panel share for a little bit. And then I do see questions in the chat that I want to get to afterwards. So I do see you. I just want to make note of that.
So the first thing that actually comes to mind when you bring that up, and what I think is like a good way to meet in the middle, I'm not sure if you guys have watched or heard of one of Gordon Ramsay's many shows. It's called Uncharted, and it's available on Disney Plus. And in the show, he visits different countries and he learns from like the top chefs in those countries, and like, by the end of the week or by the end of whatever period, he comes up with recipes like using ingredients from those places where he's learned to like properly honor tradition, whether that is like cooking or in layout. And I just like really loved watching it. One of his first episodes is actually in Peru, so that was a great way of representation, and he just like travels around, but I don't know, it was my first thought.
I think that's a great way. It's like food is like honestly the best way. Inviting someone to the carne asada is like it's food. Everybody needs food, and that's a great way to like, in my opinion, meet in the middle and like encourage, you know, discussion and enlightenment. I think with companies, it's really difficult to, you know, gauge the authenticity on if it's an opportunity or if it's like an actual, we're trying to create a community. And I think my general, what I think about there is this company putting up a banner for Hispanic Heritage Month? And that's it? Or are they also like raising up their own employees? Are they like trying to be diverse internally? I think that's something that I try to be conscious of in terms of like, I think it's great to get awareness during Hispanic Heritage Month of brands I may not have known before and discovered, but I think it starts at home in these companies. Like, are you lifting up these people that you are showing in your ads during Hispanic Heritage Month or not? So it's hard to draw the line like anywhere, but I think that's for me, like how I kind of draw that line.
Agreed. And Alfonso touched on this earlier. Disney, I think, does a really, really good job. We are Disney people, my family and I, and those of you who know me know that's incredibly true. But I love even the different parts in the parks themselves where you can see people kind of gather together. And a lot of them look like me and you know, are speaking Spanish to each other, but then there's other folks who come in and it's very welcoming. And like, I love that. That to me feels very authentic, it's not just a tag, you know what I mean? And to me, that's to Chanel's point, like it has to be more than a month. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, I think that you can visibly see it when companies or celebrities are really trying to connect with the community, or, you know, they're just really trying to monetize and take advantage of the culture. But again, it kind of like Chanel and Junior said, it all starts with who's on top and, you know, who's at the helm of everything. And if there's a person that cares about it, then, you know, it'll be to connect with the community. If it's someone that not necessarily cares about it and cares more about, you know, monetizing something, then, you know, it'll be a clear distinction.
Anyone else want to share? Thank you all for sharing those examples. You totally don't have to, but does anyone else have anything they want to add or just ask a question or share about this?
I really do want to know your thoughts on the NFL with the little Enya sign, because I have no idea how to feel about that, quite honestly.
Well, I have my thoughts. Alfonso, I know he works in sports, so I like defer to the sports guy, but I have my own perspective.
Yeah, you know, all the thoughts and all the tweets and everything that came from it, I totally agree with it. I mean, it was just it was pretty messy. It was pretty sloppily done, I would say, like just adding the Enya, and a lot of people were comparing it to the Office skit where the guy just puts the Enya on lemonade and said it was Mexican lemonade. So yeah, that's just kind of another example of like, you know, who's in the room making these decisions? When are these decisions being made? You know, unfortunately, as we see the rise and demand in Latin American aesthetic and representation, we're starting to see a lot of companies having to grapple with it. And really, when you don't have, when you like the panelists have already said, when it hasn't started at home, when people haven't had those discussions already, you're then going to see those cringy examples come out, and you're going to see the pushback from the community. And I think the biggest takeaway is having the community push back and speak up about these things when they see it. And I think that then serves as an example, that then serves as a case study for the next company to not mess up in that way. And I think a lot of people, hopefully, you know, they'll start doing their campaigns much earlier than Hispanic Heritage Month, but they'll use that example in mind as far as, okay, well, we really upset a lot of people and we shouldn't do this again.
Yeah, and I think too, like something that I've seen in the different communities that I've been in is that there are things that are not socially acceptable to do because people have pushed back on it. So like in the Black community, it's not socially acceptable to wear blackface. Like that in 2022, if you walk up and do that, or you're on a show and you do that, you're done, right? And so where has been the pushback of communities saying this is socially unacceptable to do, and where can we kind of take a stance on that too? And I think that's what makes it hard, especially in this community, is because we're so mixed, we're so diverse, we're not a monolith, we're not just like one people that speak for one group, right? But at the same time, it's like, what are we going to allow as acceptable and not? And there are certain things where it's like, if you are capitalizing off of a culture that you then exploit and oppress, that's not cool. Or like that is exactly the things that we should be fighting against, right? And someone put in the chat too, money is a great motivator, because it is. We live in a capitalistic system in which culture is exploited and commodified into things that we can buy. Like you can buy culture in this country, which is crazy, right? Because culture is something that is like shared between people and community, but in this country we've commodified it so that you can buy it and say like, well, I bought this, so now I'm a part of this group. And so that's where we really have to have those conversations within our community of like, again, what does it mean to me as an individual from this community to be represented? What do I want to see? How do I want my story to be told? And not like, do I want to go to Target and be able to read a sign in Spanish? That could be representation for somebody. And I don't want to take that away from that person, but also it could not be. And someone could say, Target, what did you do to support the community during the hurricane season, right? So I think it means different things to different people, but there's some things that like we need to push back on as being socially unacceptable. Like anytime that you are mocking or doing something that's degrading to a community with historical context, that should be an unacceptable behavior. And yet as a community, we sometimes struggle to call those things out because we do want to just invite everyone to the carne asada. And sometimes I'm like, maybe I don't want to invite you. Like, you know, like maybe you have to like earn your place and get to know me and my culture before I invite you. And I think that's a conversation that we need to have within our own communities because it's a very real one. So yeah, thank you all for sharing. Did anyone else have anything you wanted to add before we kind of wrap up?
Yeah, Uma, Rodrigo raised a good question. Like, how do we avoid becoming gatekeepers of our culture,
Yeah.
but also trying to share it with the world? I understand that we can call people out, taking advantage of monetizing, but where's the line?
Yeah, I'm gonna actually, that's part of my closing. So I'm gonna try and answer it in the closing, if that's cool with everybody. Because that's a really good question. And again, that's something that like I as an individual don't have an answer to, and probably Alfonso as well, but based on our own experiences, like we can kind of share some of the things that we've done. Yeah, so I'm going to just share one more kind of like our end goal takeaways, because for people who know me, which is not very many of you, but a few know that the class in which I teach with students is a class about taking action. So I'm all about historical context and like, here are the issues, but now what? Like, what are tangible things that you can do? So these are just some things. Support all media that has been created by people of color, by Black people, by Asian Americans, by Latin Americans, by everybody, because they are out there and they're not being pushed into the mainstream media because we're not like actively as whole communities supporting these groups of people. So a movie, a book, a show, a podcast, like show up, like buy a ticket to go see that movie or watch that show on Netflix or on HBO, like speak out when it gets canceled after a season, even though it was really good, you know, like support all of these media outlets, because the dominant media is dominant because of the support that it gets. So we can only show up and show out for our people if we support in that way too. Really look at who is creating content and why. That's a really important question that we ask ourselves often. Like when I see something and I'm like, oh, cool, but who made it? That's actually recently with food too. Like when I go to restaurants, I'm like, oh, this is super cool, but who's the chef? Like, who's the person behind this? And then my next question is like, well, why? Like, why this person and not someone from the community, right? So again, if it's so individual, and that's what makes this conversation so hard, is like for someone who sees a restaurant that's making, you know, their home cooked meal, they're like, I don't care who the chef is. I just want my home cooked meal and this food is really good. And that's okay. And also, like, it's okay to question, well, why is this person a white dude who traveled to Mexico for a summer, and why does he get to have a platform versus my abuelita who's made this food her whole life, right? So always kind of ask yourself those questions. Like, if someone is creating something and it has to do with your community, ask yourself like who that person is and why, like what is their intention? Because it could very, very well just be monetary. And then you have to question, like, is that something I want to support, right? That's an individual decision as a consumer. Don't accept breadcrumbs is something I say a lot. Like, the resources are out there. Clearly, Latinos and Latinas and all of us are making waves. Like, the fact that everyone wants to go talk about Bad Bunny and see Bad Bunny right now, like, yeah, they should, right? So don't accept like your one movie a year, or as someone in the chat put, like your Hispanic Heritage Month. Like, your culture is not defined by 1 month. That's a very much a tactic and tool of the dominant culture to keep us all in our place, right? So what I like to talk about in my history class is like, we learn about all cultures, all days of the year, all weeks of the year. We don't learn about Hispanic and Latin American people in the month of September and October, right? So don't accept that. Like, yes, it's great to highlight our culture and to talk about these things, but no, it shouldn't be diluted to just 1 month, because we're so much more than that. Always, like I said, question who's being over and underrepresented in the space. Like, look at skin color, hair texture, language, and place of origin, and then pay attention to who's making decisions and historical context. Going back to the question, how do we avoid becoming gatekeepers while also trying to share with the world? That's a really good question. And again, it's hard to answer because it's so based on individuals. But again, I would say like, I would say that asking the right questions about who's creating spaces and content isn't gatekeeping. I actually think that the real gatekeepers in our society have been the dominant culture, right? Because they have gate-kept media, they've gate-kept Hollywood, all of these things, right? And then the rest of us have had to fight for a space in that. So I don't think it's gatekeeping to try and say, hey, like, if you're a part of this community, you should be the first person to be able to share your story. That doesn't mean other people can't share about their experiences. But I think where we get lost is that people who have no direct experience to a community get to share that story on behalf of others. And that's really where we should be pushing back on that. But I think like sharing culture and sharing stories are important because that's how you learn about other people and their experiences. I just think we should be asking ourselves who gets to say it first. Like who gets to write the book, who gets to produce the show, who gets to create the menu for the food, right? Because that isn't gatekeeping. It's just making sure that culture is actually something that gets to be shared amongst the community of people who worked so hard to keep it. And that doesn't mean you can't share it, but it just means you have the right to say who tells your story, because a lot of people in dominant society have that right. They have the right to say, this is my story and this is exactly how I want to play me in the movie. This is exactly how the script should be written, right? So why can't we also demand those same things? Do you have anything to add, Alfonso?
Yeah, and I know we're short on time here, but I think the example I just recently saw, again, I work in social media, so I consume a lot of social media content, but I came across this really awesome video which explained just the barrier of entry for, this is a separate topic, but like barrier of entry for Black people within hip hop. Why is it so hard? Why do we expect, you know, Black people to be so good at hip hop, yet when we have a Jack Harlow or an Eminem who's a white person, and it's like it's different, then everyone gravitates towards that and like wants to praise that and be like, oh, that's so awesome that a white dude is doing that. What that does then is that it creates a power dynamic where, you know, the person who's actually part of the culture has to work twice as hard in their own space to get even just a little bit of that acknowledgement. And I see that manifested in one of the examples that I shared. There was a guy playing the huira, you know, a Dominican instrument, and he's playing that, and he's a white dude from Oregon, and everyone is like praising this guy. It's like, oh, it's awesome, there's a white guy playing our music. There's hundreds and hundreds of other huira players on TikTok, also from the Dominican Republic, creating their own content, and they're not getting the same attention that this guy is getting. So when we talk about gatekeeping, these are the things that we have to keep in mind. These are the things about, like, you know, who's doing what, and, you know, kind of realizing with what intention it's being done.
Awesome. Thank you, panelists. I know that we went over time, but that is okay. I think Steve Jones said it best in the chat. I thank you, Uma, Alfonso, and the entire panel. Your strong and clear voices are so powerful and appreciated. This was a really great discussion and interactive conversation, and we thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.